It's the end. We made it. We did it. I have indeed been here all day, like the rest of you, and what an inspiration to be here. What an inspiring day. How amazing to be in the presence of all these great thinkers and leaders. And I have to say that it was such a thrill. I thought at several points throughout the day, I said, I'm so lucky to be able to be here and to be thinking about everything that everybody's saying and digesting it, and then trying to give you guys a final summary about what you just experienced. A brief, quick, charming, smart, batting cleanup, right? Well, I learned a lot, and one of the things that I learned very early on was a little lesson about how to get people involved in a talk that you're doing. And so I'm going to ask you to do what Dr. Daryl did, which is to turn to your neighbor and say something. I'd like you to all turn to your neighbor and say, "I am inspired." Go for it. Yeah, no, just keep saying it. No, I'm joking. This is truly dreamlike. This is truly magnificent. It's a visionary feeling to hear you all saying it. I also learned about the meaning of this. Love. Love. How many of you knew that this means love? Lift your hand. A handful. You thought it meant hang loose. That's this. I thought this meant I worship Satan. I come from a rock and roll background, and that's what all the heavy metal, I mean, just goes to show how little we really know. I learned that we will soon, in the near future, have robots that will be cooking breakfast for us and also cleaning it up. I think this was the premise of Blade Runner, though. You remember that's what's going on there. It's the pleasure bots turn on us, and they become militant radicals. So I don't know if I'm ready for that. I don't know if I'm ready for the chef bot to prepare me eggs with hollandaise and then sweep it up. I also learned that the secret to longevity is optimism. Converting possibly negative things into positives, reframing things, and I think that's really true. I believe that, and if that could allow me to age as gracefully as our conductor did, then I definitely will continue to do that. So I definitely, that resonated with me. So here we are, radical life extension. That is the theme of this day, radical life extension. We spoke about some data. We spoke about how many people want to live to be 120, and how most people would like to live to be 94 in Canada. Is that right, 94? Yeah, most CARP people would like to live to be 94. One of the figures in the survey that was held, the Pew survey that was done in America that stuck with me, was that only 4% of Americans would like to live to be over 120. Only 4% of people in America that were surveyed would like to live to be older than 120. That's not a lot of people. Most people don't want to live to be 200 years old if they could. Now, not a lot of people have lived to be over 120, but I find it interesting that that's not a desired thing. I find it quite fascinating myself, especially when our first speaker suggested that we make a pact to live to be 150. Now, given the fact that only 4% of people want to live to be older than 120, how many of you here, after hearing that, felt like you do want to make a pact to live to be 150? One and a quarter, two and a quarter. You know what? Oh. We've got an immortalist in the house. my book is about immortality. It's called The Book of Immortality, and it looks at the idea of immortality and how we've always been fascinated with it, and how it's something that has always been part of humanity's lore, and how we have always told stories about the meaning of death through immortality. And immortality is always a story that we tell to try to make sense of death. And there are so many different guises that immortality has taken over the ages. It just has manifested itself in countless religions. Every religion, in fact, is about immortality. But it also is something that is presently being discussed in terms of science and medicine. And so what I learned while researching it, I learned many things. I learned a book's worth of things about immortality, but I had the opportunity to speak to both spiritual leaders about what immortality means in their faith, and also to scientists about what's really happening in terms of radical life extension. And I also got a chance to speak with magicians and to ask them. I went to David Copperfield, the magician David Copperfield's private island in the Bahamas, where he claims to have found the Fountain of Youth. And so I went to go investigate. And I'm a writer, I'm a journalist, I'm a reporter, I'm a relatively neutral person. And one of the things that I learned is that I respect everybody's beliefs. We all have beliefs when it comes to the unknowability of death. And anything that helps us cope with grief and loss is good and important and valid. It's also something that can be manipulated, which is why we're wary of it, and I think it's healthy to be skeptical given some of the things that are happening. And one of the things that's interesting to me that so few people seem to realize is that there is not a single thing that can be done presently to prolong the human lifespan. There's no intervention that we can take that will make us live longer. It's hard to hear that. I mean, most of us assume that things are happening that are making us live longer. We are living longer. We don't quite know exactly why that is. There's debate around it. And what's so amazing about a day like this is that we get to engage in that debate with the people who are at the front lines of the debate. And we get to hear what they have to say, and we get to hear their arguments. And we definitely heard some differing arguments today. We heard both sides of the spectrum. One thing that I immediately think of is when we heard the doctor say that our kids are not going to live as long as we do. So lifespan will in fact decrease. He spoke about generation XXL, and he said that childhood obesity is a big reason for that. But then we also heard differing opinions. We heard that our lifespan will continue going up, just as it has. I mean, there's indisputable facts. Human lifespan today is longer than it has ever been. But what is not certain is whether that will continue. We don't know. There's no way of knowing, and we don't know what's to come, but we also cannot necessarily manipulate that. Now, we'd like to think that there are treatments. Moses, you brought up the idea of caloric restriction being what you thought to be the one sure thing that can make us live longer, and then our colleague informed us that no, in fact, caloric restriction doesn't seem to be a sure thing. You also mentioned, how did you put it? The other thing that can make us live longer?
Suppression of reproduction.
Suppression of reproduction. Not having sex. Who wants that, right? There's one interesting study I came across that spoke about zapping the gonads on fruit flies. You can just blast their reproductive organs off and they'll live 30% longer. There are so many weird things that are being done right now in laboratories around the world. I mean, one of the things that makes worms live longer is painting them yellow. Dyeing them yellow with basic yellow food dye makes them live like 40% longer than they normally live. There are antifungal microbes coming out of the soil of Easter Island that seem to play a role in the lifespan of mice. There are elements that are found, there's something called spermidine, which is a molecule found in grapefruit and human sperm that seems to play some mysterious, as yet misunderstood role in longevity. All of these things seem to play some role in small organisms, like they may have some bearing on us at some point. But for now, none of them do. There is not a single proven way of extending human lifespan. Now, we can look at that in two ways. We can either be disappointed about that, and you could say, hey, well, I've been promised by science that I will live longer, maybe 150, maybe a couple of decades longer, or, and we're frustrated about that. One of the interesting words that came up today was something called a let me get this straight, geroprotector. Have you heard of this? Has anybody heard of a geroprotector before? Something that can protect us from aging? Well, there isn't anything. Aging is still a fact of life. And how interesting that some people see it as a disease. And this is another one of the big debates that came up today. And it's an important debate in radical life extension. Is aging a disease, or is it a fact of life? Is it something that we will find a way to eliminate, or is it something that will always be with us? Maybe let's do an informal poll right here, our own CARP poll. How many people think aging is a disease that science will find a way to cure? Is aging a disease? Yes? Who thinks that aging is a disease? What about you people who want to live to be 150? There was 1.25 of you.
It's clear that science has been helping us to live longer. And
Absolutely.
remember that a mere 100 years ago, if somebody had said it's God's will, they would have meant you died at 50. Now it's God's will that you're going to die in the mid-80s, and possibly you will achieve the 94 years that most people in CARP seem to desire. So I am not at all concerned that we will not get to 120. And I think the question is not properly posed. If you say to someone, do you want to live to 150, and they immediately flash on their grandmother or their grandmother's grandmother and the way they aged and the way they died, you would say no. Any rational person would say no. But if the question was, do you want to live to be 120 in your 40-year-old body? It would be a very different answer.
That would be wonderful if we could do it. It would be wonderful if we could do it. But I think that what we're discussing today is whether that can be done. One of the things that is coming up is can we live to be 120 in a 40-year-old's body? Spare parts.
Well, I'd say a good number of people in this room already have spare parts. Right? No, think about it. Teeth, knees, hips. These are miracles. These are wonders. We live in an age of wonders, and it does not surprise me that we will continue to discover more wonders.
I absolutely agree, and I think this truly is an age of wonders, and I'm constantly amazed at the wonders that surround us, and I think science is magnificent, and I think that one of the things that really amazed me today was how you brought science and spirituality together, such a conjunction of opposites. And I think it was difficult for some of the presenters who were very much on one side rather than the other to be faced with these really different opinions. But that is exactly why an event like this needs to exist, is to present these different sides of the coin and to confront us with beliefs that are different from ours.
And if I may,
by all means.
there are apparently species of jellyfish that are actually immortal. That never
now you're going to get
die.
me started on immortal jellyfish.
Okay.
Immortal jellyfish, it brings up the term, what is immortal? Okay, so an immortal jellyfish is a story it's a story that's already about 15 years old, but the New York Times did a cover story on it a year ago. The immortal jellyfish, it seems to have the capacity to regenerate itself. But what is immortality? What is immortality? The jellyfish, if you get to page 14 out of 15 of that story, you find that the jellyfish is very easily killed, often eaten by slugs, and as soon as you take it out of water, it collapses and dies. Is that immortal? Or is that just a quirk that belongs to a strange, tiny organism that lives in the water, which is that it's not a vertebrate species, it's a jellyfish that's in the water. Now, what are we going to do? Are we going to try to take what's in that jellyfish, that strange reproductive quirk, and somehow bring it into ourselves? Is that what we're working on? I've spoken to many scientists about that jellyfish story, and many of them were dismayed at the way it presented the real science, at the way it kind of left the truth to the end of the article. And it made us believe. I mean, that's the thing. We all are so desperate to believe that there is something out there that can make us live forever. And what happens is that we often fall into unthinkingness when we're confronted with it. The immortal jellyfish is not an immortal jellyfish. Let's talk about another thing that is similar to that, but different, a worm. We all know, what happens when you cut off the head of a worm? Are we going to start cutting our heads off and wiggling around? I mean,
Ted Williams' family did that. Right?
Which brings us to cryonicism.
They froze his head.
Also fascinating. Cryonics is a fascinating experiment. I went down to the Cryonics Institute in Detroit to go speak with them. It's a funeral home. It's what it really is. You know, there's all these bodies in there, frozen, stored in liquid nitrogen in these big white canisters in these tanks, plunged head first. They wrap them in sleeping bags, and they're stored there. But if you look on the wall, there's a certificate that allows it to be a funeral home, a cemetery. I mean, we can all choose how we want to dispose of our remains. We can also choose how we want to see the fact of death. Do we think that we are simply lying in state in suspended animation, like temporary uncurables until science will find a way to regenerate us? Or are we actually cadavers in liquid nitrogen? It really depends. They would see it one way, others would see it another way. I mean, I found it fascinating and bizarre. Most people, I think, would agree that the people in there are dead and that dead people cannot be brought back to life. But they don't believe that. And I guess I'll just leave us with one last thought. It's kind of the end. Belief is so important at mediating our relationship to death. And it's crucial, and I think that it's very important to respect people's beliefs. And I keep coming back to that. Today we were presented with such a confluence of different beliefs. And I think they're all fascinating. I think that everybody's beliefs are valid and good and positive if they help us make sense of death. And I think that death is real. I think that what's interesting about the immortality debate today is that many of them think death is not real and that we will not die. And I had an interesting chat with the first speaker backstage, and I said, to you, what's the difference between longevity and immortality? And he said, I don't want to get into that conversation. And I said, but I think it's an important conversation because many people are getting the two confused. The media tells us that longevity naturally leads to what? To living to 150, to living to 1,000, to living to 5,000, to never dying. And so he said, I don't want to engage in that. But I said, to me, I do see a difference between longevity and immortality. Longevity means living longer, living healthier, having a healthy life that lasts for as long as we would like it to last, whether it's 94, as most carp people want, 150, as some of us want. Immortality is a fantasy. Immortality is not a fact. There are no organisms that are immortal. The immortal jellyfish is not immortal. Immortality is another story. Physical immortality is another story that we tell to try to make sense of death. And I think that what's interesting about the physical immortalists is that they say that we need to eliminate the idea that death is real and natural. And they say that people who believe that death is real are deathists. And that's where the world is at today. Beliefs about what death means. This conference, however, is about optimism. It's about imagination. It's about finding love as we go forward. And it's about great ideas and great leaders. And one of the things that I'll never forget was being able to sit here and witness that great talk. All those leaders around the table talking about Medicare, this thing that makes us Canadian, this thing that nobody loves, as somebody said. Nobody loves Medicare, but yet it is the thing that makes us who we are, more than almost anything. And how wonderful to have an event that brings people together to think about and discuss and push and challenge all of us as we go forward. So thank you very much for coming.